Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. The 61st Munich Security Conference has concluded, revealing deep divisions between the US and its European allies over the Ukraine peace talks. Vice President J.D. Vance's controversial remarks and Trump's direct outreach to Putin have raised concerns that Europe could be sidelined in any peace talks. To craft a response, European leaders are gathering in Paris. Can Europe remain relevant at a time of changing foreign policy dynamics? Can a united front save Ukraine and temper Trump's more adventurous ideas? Well, joining us is Professor Kerry Longhurst of Collegium Civitas to unpack the conference's key takeaways and what we can expect in Paris. Kerry, welcome back to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure as always. So let's start with Munich. It's just wound up. What are the main takeaways for you from there?
Yeah, I mean, previous conferences have also been quite startling and scary and worrying, but I think this particular one is even more cause for concern than previous editions or iterations. As you said, already the speeches were very provocative. They were quite insulting. It seems that the Americans, obviously in partnership with Putin, are very keen to exclude the EU or Europeans from the negotiating table. But I think one thing for me really is that Vance's speech, which was so forceful and so badly received from the European side, didn't even sketch out a kind of plan or an idea or a strategic vision which was favourable for Ukraine. It really was just an export of Make America Great Again into a European theatre or context, telling us how it's going to be, how you've got to receive it, tell us what you're going to do with that. Right,
but General Keith Kellogg is Trump's envoy, isn't he, with responsibility for some kind of peace negotiations in Ukraine. I think many were surprised by the fact that Vance barely touched on that issue. Now, tell me, in terms of the peace, there are many other issues also discussed, including who's going to be involved in any peace negotiations, in any peace talks, and the role of Europe in those. What did you make of those conversations?
Yeah, well, I think there's two big issues there. The first one is, you called it peace mediation, peace settlement. I would contend that that's not at all what it's all about. If we look historically, if we look at the situation around the world, any peace settlement has to involve a wider group of stakeholders. The fact that Ukraine has been cut out, that Europe is being cut out, this is not the framework that's needed for anything that could be called a peace settlement.
Why do you think the Americans did this?
It's totally in line with President Trump's view of his style of presidency. It's in line with his view of how America is supreme over the world. And it's one autocracy talking to another autocracy in Russia, and it's going to take place in another autocracy in Saudi Arabia, we've learned. So it's totally in keeping with the style of the presidency so far.
Right.
And Europe being excluded from that, which was another stylistic part of the presidency, I would say.
Understood. Well, there are a number of question marks, as you say, about the format that's being used. Although from our understanding, the topics of conversation in Saudi Arabia are going to be far broader than just Ukraine. So the Middle East, for example, there'll be some talk on the currency markets and so on. Does that surprise you? Is America simply saying, well, look, let's set some groundwork on negotiating chips, if you like, or bargaining chips, and then bring Ukraine and Europe in?
Yeah, the problem is that Ukraine in itself is a big enough topic and such an important topic that it deserves to be discussed like I said, amongst a wider group of stakeholders involving civil society, human rights issues, the whole kind of terms of what a peace settlement should be. And that's just not going to be dealt with properly in that Saudi Arabian context. But just to kind of refer back to one point you made there, it will be very interesting how Ukraine's going to be discussed alongside Gaza, because as far as I understand, Saudi Arabia and Donald Trump do not have a similar view or vision as to how the future of Gaza is going to be. But for me, I'm very pessimistic about the way in which a settlement, peace is going to be brought to Ukraine just with Russia and the US in Saudi Arabia, a small table, big egos, in a context, in a country which is not going to be sympathetic to the types of issues that really need to be discussed for the future of Ukraine. And that's where Europe should be playing a role. And it's got to push up and have some sharp elbows and bring itself to that table.
Understood. So Europe should play a role, and clearly, you know, President Macron has convened this conference, this summit in Paris for EU leaders, including, of course, NATO Secretary General. What are the expectations of this meeting? It obviously, you know, came in response to J.D. Vance's comments and General Kellogg's comments. Sure. What do you expect to see from these conversations?
Well, you know, it was long overdue, this kind of meeting. As you know, it brought together a small-ish number of the most military significant EU states, plus NATO, as you mentioned. What can we expect? Well, the words coming out of the meeting so far is that first and foremost, there's not going to be a standing EU army. But that's not surprising. No one's got the appetite for that. That project would be too big and too ambitious right now. But I think what will come out of that are definitive commitments to raising defence spending, to create more joint European projects on defence, and have a truly common voice to talk about interests. The EU talks about values a lot, which is very important, but we've got to get a bit tougher with talking about interests and working together. And I'm quite hopeful that something quite concrete will come out of this meeting. And I think not least of all, if the EU countries, the kind of key military states, do commit to a higher level of spending over a longer period and not just in a kind of short-term perspective, that could be the kind of master key, if you like, for enabling Europe to come to that negotiating table, and not just to be at the table once the dinner's set, but to actually contribute to the menu, if you like, of what a peace discussion should be like.
Understood. Now, one of the conversations was about having troops on the ground in case some kind of agreement, peace agreement is reached in Ukraine. Countries in Europe are divided on that. Prime Minister Tusk has said that basically there are not going to be any Polish troops on the ground. What do you think is behind that decision?
Maybe it's to do with public opinion not really having the appetite for that, but I think more fundamentally it's because the terms of this settlement, this Trump-Putin settlement that we're kind of expecting with a bit of anxiety, hasn't been sketched out. So I think for any country to say, absolutely, we will devote troops on the ground to Ukraine at some point in the near future is just not palatable for domestic opinion right now. But I wouldn't rule that kind of action out in a longer term, in a different kind of framework or context. Yes,
yeah, so it does remain to be seen. I mean, Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom has already said that he'd be, you know, prepared to send troops in.
Sure, but crucially always within some kind of multinational context, and that's obviously key for all EU member states and Britain as well.
Yes.
That it wouldn't be going alone, it would have to be in concert or tandem or trilateral or multinational kind of context, not at all something individual and national.
Right. Now, before getting on the plane to go to Paris, the other thing that Prime Minister Tusk referred to was, as part of his comment on not sending troops to Ukraine, was that he very much saw Poland's role as a bridge, if you like, between the United States and Europe. What do you think he might have meant by those words?
I think it's wishful thinking. You hear about this bridge or this special relationship quite a few times between different European states and the United States of America. As you know, the UK has been peddling this, special relationship for decades, and indeed it was once upon a time, I think, quite special. But whether Poland can claim to have the ear of the president in Washington, I'm not really convinced. It was only quite recently that Trump was toying with the idea or threatening or flirting with the notion of pulling troops out of this part of Europe. So I don't think that Tusk should be quite confident in that area at all. No.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned pulling troops out, US troops out of Poland. Pete Hegseth, of course, went to meet American troops in Poland, and he actually said something quite perhaps surprising. He said that he envisions having even more US troops in Poland. So mixed messages coming out from the US side.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to say that's just because they haven't got a very joined up policy. There's lots of egos and different voices, and it's a fairly new administration, so maybe they're finding their feet. But I think perhaps what it is a purposeful strategy to muddy the waters, to kick up lots of dust, to cause confusion, to put us Europeans on edge. So I think it could well be actually on purpose.
Right. Well, that's interesting you say that, because Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski said that Trump has a method of operating, and I'll paraphrase what he said, because there is a Russian phrase for it. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. You push, you see what happens, and then you change your position. Do you think that's probably a fair assessment of Trump's strategy?
I mean, Sikorski has obviously got a long-term relationship with the United States. He worked there. I mean, this is his milieu, the Euro-Atlantic area. So I'm sure that's completely correct. And based upon the previous administration in the States and the new Trump administration, I think that's what we're seeing all the time. But really, I think one of the key things that Europe has to do in response to that is to be less timid, to be joined up and to spend more on defence. I think speaking from a position of strength is what will be the counterweight or the answer that we need to respond to this, I won't say nonsense, but this mixed up messaging coming from the United States.
Understood. A united, robust defence industry and defence posture but there's a challenge, isn't there, with so many EU countries, and we know that some will step out of line. They won't support this strategy. Isn't that one of the main problems with the EU?
Yeah, I mean, it always has and it always will be. It's a large number of states, probably will grow over the next decade or so. And so it always has to be a consensus. It always has to be a compromise. And it means that the EU strategies are never going to be perfect and they're not going to be quick. But the stakes are so high right now that the EU has got to find some internal mechanisms to really be leaner and quicker, with a faster tempo, to deal with these types of issues.
Okay, well, we'll be watching very carefully, and we hope you'll come back and share your insights when we know more. Dr. Kerry Longhurst, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
And that's all from this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.